Here you're looking at a wrestling finish from back in the day, and here you're looking at one from this year's SummerSlam. Notice the difference? Well, if not, you're about to, because while this year's SummerSlam was a really good show, I have to admit, I did have a problem with, well, the close. Which one? Well, just about all of them. So what exactly is my issue with this? Well, it's the topic of this episode, because today... A big thank you to my supporters over on Patreon, such as Dakari Garmin, Mr. J, Ron Hawthorne, Mangy Stray, Harry Flynn, and The Reflection of Perfection. Thank you so much for all the help, it really does mean a lot. When it comes to modern wrestling, many fans feel differently about how the whole thing is presented. But there is one detail in specific that I feel has become a bit of an issue that we're not really talking about. And this year's SummerSlam has done a great job of highlighting exactly that, but not necessarily in a great way. And in case you think I have a problem with all the run-ins, well, that's not my specific beef, but it is an offshoot of that. But before I get into the summertime fiasco, we have to talk about a concept known as move economy. What is that exactly? Well, for that, let's go to the dictionary. Economy: thrifty and efficient use of material resources, frugality in expenditures. Also, efficient and concise use of non-material resources such as effort, language, or motion. Now, when we apply this to the world of wrestling and we look at the idea of move economy, we find that this is a concept that seemingly has slipped through the cracks over the years, as many fans, and yes, some wrestlers too, really could use a refresher course on the idea, as there are multiple benefits in not using more moves than necessary. For starters, when you remember that every wrestler has a bump card and sooner or later that card will fill up, it behooves you to remember that every move you take is yet another one you won't be able to take later on. And in that case, why do more than you absolutely have to? And sure, no beginning wrestler wants to think about their own retirement. But if you look at things this way, when that day does come, it's most likely going to be as a result of your own choosing rather than something you're forced into. Extra moves, unnecessary moves all lead to more possibility of injury. Hey, even the simple ones have a little bit of risk. So I say, take the time to really choose your moves wisely and make the most efficient time of your time in the ring. And continuing with the idea of move economy, one thing that a lot of wrestlers seem to struggle with is the pacing, because, well, it tends to move pretty fast. This is fast-paced wrestling after all. But there is another solution to that, and it's a piece of advice that a lot of beginner wrestlers get all the time, even some veterans in fact. What is this tidbit of information? Well, one of the biggest pieces of advice that beginning wrestlers always get is that when you think you're going slow enough, slow down more, as the adrenaline and the heart-pumping action makes you feel like you're going slower than you actually are, as what might feel like 10 minutes in your head might only be about 30 seconds. So it's important to take your time and slow the pacing down. Don't try to jam in as much as you possibly can, because a lot of that needlessly picks up the pace. So remember, slow down. And that's advice for everyone, except for maybe Randy Orton. Furthermore, another benefit to having a slower pace is that it gives the audience a time to really register what's happening. It's really hard for an audience to absorb and process what's going on if you've already done 5 or 6 more things just seconds after the first thing happened. And yes, I get it, that faster paced action is more exciting, but this is not to say that you can't do that at all. You just have to pick your moments, as you could speed up for a portion of the match, but allow the rest of it to breathe. And speaking of breathing and going back to safety, wrestlers getting gassed right away is something else that you have to take into consideration, because if you're moving at 100 miles an hour, that just means your wrestlers are gonna get tired faster. And tired wrestlers tend to make more mistakes than fully rested ones. And also, if you go at a moderate pace, you're less likely to have to use rest holds, which nobody finds entertaining. In other words, it's better to do the speed limit the whole way through while occasionally stepping on the gas, rather than flooring it and then having to fill up every 2 minutes. Because despite the analogy I just gave, wrestling is not a race, it's a story. And storytelling is the exact thing that I feel should be one of the major focal points, one of the major parts of any wrestling match, because it's how you tie everything together and it's how you get people emotionally invested. Not to mention, it's a great way to also keep things safe. And when telling a story, you have to make sure that everything happens in a logical order and everything that happens makes sense. It's gotta have a reason behind it, or else it's just meaningless. It's just chaos and not a story. But with that, we're finally ready to talk about this year's SummerSlam, or at least parts of this year's SummerSlam. And for that, well, let's just go ahead and get into it. Now, this year's SummerSlam represents something that I feel has been kinda systematic throughout modern wrestling, and it's that a lot of finishes have become overly convoluted and just plain nonsensical. Now, immediately, a lot of fans will be really quick to point out that this year's SummerSlam had a whole onslaught of unclean finishes. Somebody was doing dirty in just about every bout. Dominic Mysterio interfered in Liv Morgan vs. Rhea Ripley, Machine Gun Kelly got involved in Logan Paul vs. LA Knight, Tiffany Stratton got involved in Nia Jax vs. Bayley, Seth Rollins, the special guest referee, obviously got involved in CM Punk vs. Drew McIntyre, Finn Balor interfered in Damian Priest vs. Gunther, and of course Roman Reigns popped up in Cody Rhodes vs. Solo Sikoa, with Braun Breaker and Sami Zayn being the only match with a clean finish. However, that is not what I have a problem with. My problem is that a wrestling match is a story, and as such, a story should have a natural and logical conclusion. But today, it seems like when there's a lot of run-ins or slightly more complex finishes, booking feels the need to go hat on hat. For example, have you ever noticed that when a wrestler runs in and lays someone out, their opponent always has to do their finisher instead of just pinning them right then and there, even if the wrestler who ran in also did their finisher to him too? Why not just pin him? Or how about this? Also from this year's SummerSlam, Liv Morgan brings a chair into the ring, Dominic Mysterio takes it away from Rhea Ripley, involving himself in the match. Liv hits Oblivion, but Rhea kicks out, only for Dom to get involved yet again, bringing the chair back in, allowing for Liv Morgan to hit Oblivion one more time, and then get the win. Would it not be more simple? Would it not be more streamlined to just let Liv get the win after the first time around, except just include the chair with the first Oblivion? Because other than that, it really makes no difference. The same person won off of the same move thanks to Dom's interference. And I know there are going to be some of you out there saying, well, I actually don't mind this practice, and you're going to have your reasons, but before you go talking about that, let's just keep on going. Now, there are going to be some people who try to defend this idea by saying that it saves face, that it makes a wrestler look strong in defeat, or that the back and forth keeps the audience guessing. Well, not only is that not true, but it's also more damaging than it is helpful. Because the biggest problem with both of these defenses is that, as we all know, wrestling is a work. It is predetermined. We don't take this seriously when a wrestler kicks out of another wrestler's finisher. We don't look at it and say, well, they got jumped from behind and they ate a finisher, but then they kicked out, so at least it took 2 finishers for them to be put away. And to be clear, I'm not saying that because we all know that wrestling is not a legitimate fight. It means that we could just forget about logic and throw it right out of the window and do anything we want. No, quite the opposite. What I am saying is that when we see a wrestler eat 2 finishers, one of which is on a chair, that doesn't make us look down on them any less than if they just took one. And that's because we don't look down on them in the first place for jobbing. Sure, we may be unhappy with the results, we may not like booking, but we don't think less of the individual wrestler just because they took one less finisher. And furthermore, because wrestling is predetermined, we have to take extra care to put the logic into the match, as it's not inherently there because this is not a legitimate contest. When people take a hit, they're not really taking a hit, they're not really getting hurt, and so you have to add that in or else the effects don't mean anything. A finisher only finishes a match if you book it to finish a match, and if you don't, then it stops being exactly what it's supposed to be. But now, I'm sure some of you are thinking that, well, since we all know it's kayfabe and we don't really look down on them, then doesn't that mean we can't look up to them either if they do it right? Well, no, that's not exactly what happens, because, well, there's the whole logic of the story, the exact thing we've been talking about. So, while we don't have any more respect for someone who kicks out of a finisher just because we know it's predetermined, what we can respect about them is how well they tell a story. And on a subconscious level, the audience knows this, because you'll see they get so much more invested when the story is treated as if it was real, and when it makes sense, than when it doesn't. Emotional investment, ratings, merchandise sales, all these things go up when the story is told well, when it is done really right. Even if the fans don't realize that's why they're into it. And even with this convoluted finish, a lot of us are still into what's going on with Dom and Liv and the rest of the Judgment Day. I'm just saying that I think it would do a lot better if they just had a straightforward conclusion. And also, again, let's remember safety and the bump card. And if you're thinking that this is the only time that this has happened, no, because it's not even the only time it happened at SummerSlam. It happened pretty much throughout the show, but there is one other specific example I'd like to bring up. So for example, how about Damian Priest versus Gunther? Now, since we were just talking about logic, quick side note, I absolutely hated Damian blatantly rolling Gunther towards the rope to set up for the Finn Balor finish. Yes, we know that's why he did it, but it just makes this match look so phony because it makes no kayfabe sense. Anyway, that atrocity aside, this is another example where we could have went straight to the conclusion of the match. Finn interferes, Damian is distracted, Gunther capitalizes and gets the win. But no, instead Damian had to take a detour, where he gets out of one chokehold only to get put into another one. And yet again, couldn't they have just done this once and be done with it? What does this do other than pad the runtime? Is Damian any more over as a result? Would he have been less over if we just had it done once? And the funny thing is, talking about time, WWE had to cut the time from Sami Zayn versus Braun Breaker, the only match that didn't have a screwy finish. So maybe if they didn't do all this extra add-on stuff for all the other matches, maybe Breaker and Zayn could have went a little bit longer. Well, there you go, my issues with non-straightforward finishes. How do you feel about the subject? Let me know down in the comments, and again, this is the Thinking Fans channel, so make sure you're a Thinking Fan and you're subscribed right here. Anyway, thank you for being here, and thank you my amazing Patreon supporters, and as always, Dave knows.